I went to private school and I had a nice life and I lived in a nice house and everything looked great.
Some people are born into noise, laughter, and love, while others are born into silence.
No one knew what was going on behind the doors of that house.
Audrey Romoff grew up in a home where silence wasn't peace, it was protection. Her mother, one of Auschwitz's youngest survivors, never spoke of what she endured. Her grandmother didn't either. The trauma lived between them, unspoken, yet all-consuming.
I really looked at it as total darkness. How am I going to fight my way out of the darkness?
Audrey learned early that safety was an illusion and that control was survival. And out of that silence, Audrey built a life of spectacle.
I sort of became a barracuda.
As founder and president of Overcat Communications, she became one of Canada's most powerful public relations figures.
I never could have imagined it. Even when I decided to go out on my own, I thought I would have, this little boutique agency. And we always stayed a boutique agency. We just worked on really big stuff.
Shaping the images of icons like Lady Gaga, Sarah Jessica Parker, Shania Twain, and will.i.am. On the outside, everything sparkled, but on the inside, Audrey carried a dark silence that no photo op could light.
You have to fight to stay in the light, even if it's not going to be rainbows and unicorns.
Then in 2008, both of Audrey's parents were found dead together. Her mother's suicide was clear. Her father's death remains uncertain. But that moment shattered her carefully constructed world and set her on a journey to understand not only what she inherited in terms of the DNA of her parents, but what she could change.
I'm always going to have grief. The way I describe it, if you're lucky, it walks beside you. And if you're less lucky, it overtakes you.
Her memoir, The Ripple Eclipse, is the story of that reckoning. It moves between the glamour of red carpets and the shadows of generational pain, showing how one woman found the courage to turn silence into language and grief into growth.
Hi, it's Tony Chapman. Thank you for listening to Chatter That Matters, presented by RBC. If you can, please subscribe to the podcast, and ratings and reviews, well, they're always welcome and they're always appreciated.
Audrey Romoff, welcome to Chatter That Matters.
Hi, Tony. So happy to be here.
The first part of our interview, I want to talk about what you frame as the child in the shadow. You grew up in the shadow of silence. What does silence sound like in a home, and especially one to a little girl?
In some ways, our house was really loud, but the silence that I'm referring to was the silence around the trauma that we were all experiencing, particularly the trauma that my mother and my grandmother went through. So there was a lot of stuff going on, and in some way there was noise, but all the really pertinent stuff, that was never discussed.
And your mother, Rachel, survived Auschwitz as a child, and she hated the word survivor. Why?
If someone knew that she was a survivor of Auschwitz, that it automatically labeled her as damaged. And one of the things that my mother was really cognizant of when she moved to Canada when she was 11 was really integrating herself into the Canadian fabric of society. So she never wanted to be identified as a survivor. She took great pride in looking like she was born in Canada, but she also had a tattoo on her left arm.
Her mother, your grandmother, also held that secret. Why do you think they wanted to shelter you from that?
The book is obviously about inherited trauma. And when you go through my story, the secrecy started a very long time ago. My mother, she wasn't told that her father died. So her father died when they were leaving a labor camp called Starwicha. My mother and grandmother were on one train that was bound for Auschwitz, and my grandfather was on a train bound for Dachau. And he didn't survive that train ride. And my mother wasn't told until after the war. When my grandmother remarried in a displaced persons camp in Germany, my grandmother didn't tell her. So there was this sort of continuous shielding of the truth. And I think it was to protect people. But ultimately, given, what happened in my family, I think it's lethal to keep those types of secrets.
You talk about your father as your lifeline.
He was very accomplished. He was a doctor. He came from a good family in Montreal. And he was in a very difficult position because he really loved my mother, and that union was very important to him. But he also was witnessing that my mother was going after me because of the trauma that she had as a child. So he was always in between us, and that was a very difficult position for him. But he let me know that he thought I was smart and capable and creative, and I could do anything I set my mind to. And even as a young child, I somehow knew to pattern myself after my father and not my mother.
Did you ever find yourself, because you knew you had your father's affection, over indexing or trying to indulge your mother so she'd feel the same way about you?
There was sort of no indulging my mother because the issues that she had around me were kind of endless, and they were also evolutionary. So the issues that she had with me when I was with a young child were fairly innocuous. As I got older, as I wanted to sort of emancipate myself from, her home and from under her rule, then they became a lot more serious. So I sort of came to a place where it's not that my mother didn't love me. My mother did love me. I think my mother loved me more than anything, and I loved my mother. But there was just no way that I was ever going to be capable of bending myself into the pretzel that was going to allay all her fears. And that's what all this was about. It was about allaying her fears. And how can you allay anyone's fears when you're out in the world working? I moved to another city. I started a company. I had kids. These things are all fraught with anxiety for her.
And it's interesting that you talk about part of your ability to try to bring some sense of normalcy to your family was to make everything look fine. This sort of front could be your kind of survival skill. Was that something that evolved as you got older, or was that something inherently was just part of your way of trying to keep some sense of family and life one and the same?
Well, my therapist would say that I was bred that way. That was how I grew up. I went to private school and I had a nice life and I lived in a nice house and everything looked great. No one knew what was going on behind the doors of that house. So I was always sort of raised to be kind of like the Energizer Bunny, which was, just wind me up and send me out and I'll do what I'm supposed to do and compartmentalize the rest. So that you don't really see it. It was really important to my mother how things looked from the outside.
In many ways, your family almost reminds me of what I see on Instagram every day, where people put on this false front. They have the most interesting life, the most perfect life, the most beautiful sunrise or beautiful sunset or wherever they are. But if you really peel back the onion, you realize that it's more on the surface than what's below. And that brings me to my next question, actually, which is really what I was fascinated with, because through all of this, you build one of the most successful PR companies, Overcat Communications, and you touch the lives of people that we look into society saying some of the biggest names, the Lady Gaga, Shania Twain, will.i.am. How did that all come about? Because most children coming out of a home like that wouldn't have that sense of superpower.
It's interesting because there are studies that show how children of survivors do in their futures. And there is a lot of documentation that says, particularly first children are super, super ambitious. I didn't even realize I was ambitious until I moved to Toronto and graduated from university. I, was raised in a reasonably sheltered home, and I thought I would stay in Montreal. I would marry a doctor like my father, and I would be a stay-at-home mom. But then when I landed up in Toronto, and as soon as I started working in marketing and communications, I sort of became a barracuda and I became super competitive. I mean, I was always kind of competitive, but not in a career way. I just worked really hard. I had luck. I was working with some amazing clients who were entering into the celebrity field at that time, one company in particular. And that's how all of a sudden I found myself working with people like Sarah Jessica Parker and Jennifer Lopez and Katy Perry. And I never could have imagined it. Even when I decided to go out on my own, I thought I would have, this little boutique agency. And we always stayed a boutique agency. We just worked on really big stuff. You give up a lot because you want that career.
What did you learn from dealing with celebrities in terms of how they live their life compared to what you talked about is, I would go to work and be this one of the most respected people in terms of image management. But when I'd go home, I'd have to compartmentalize all that and deal with my own silence. So I'm curious, did you see that other people had similar baggage to carry?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of them talk about it really openly. But when you're working with them, like I was, you really understand how they get very disconnected from the real world, because there is always an entourage of people who are there to do everything for them. And I don't mean it's because they're demanding or they're being impossible. It's because that's just the nature of the beast, right? They're so busy. And I would always say, like, if we were going into an event, like many years ago when we launched Sarah Jessica Parker's first fragrance, Lovely, we had her in Toronto for 8 hours. It's like a military operation, right? Everything is timed to the last minute. Celebrities, I think I do share something with them in terms of this veneer. They know what they have to put forward. And even, when it's difficult, we did an event with Shania Twain, and there had been a problem with her plane, and she flew all night, and she came to the event, and she was incredible. So I think also when you're dealing with celebrities at that level, they're nice people and they treat other people with respect, which is not to say that was always the case with every celebrity that I worked with.
I want to go back to that question because you talk yourself, you've earned a PhD in compartmentalization, that you can go from this high stakes world, this military operation, making sure you hit every mark over those 8 hours. But inside you, it's not really what it seems. How did you find a way to cope that way? Say my life is perfect and I'm building this incredible business and I've got so much respect and I'm working with some of these wonderful people. But inside, there's a lot of things turning around that aren't the way they seem.
When you talked about, ambition and how I got to where I am, I think that I was trying to make up for something that was lacking in how I grew up, right? I was looking for validation from the outside world. After we lost a client that was a very long-term client that was very important to me, and the thought that kept running through my head is, you're looking for love in all the wrong places. And one thing is for sure, when you're dealing with clients, is as much as they love you, at some point, they're going to break up with you. It was after that client breakup that I thought, no, I have to get my self-esteem from somewhere else. I think because my mother was always sort of picking away at my self-esteem, that I really was looking for it from other places. And then I had to go back and think, no, you either have to get it from yourself and what's really important to you, your family, the people in your life that love you, the people that you love. And that's what you need to focus on, which is not to say you don't keep the career going. You do keep the career going, but it's a different methodology.
As you're building this success, working with these celebrities, did it change in any way what your mother thought of you and who you are as a human being?
A lot of it happened after she passed away. My mother loved fashion. My mother was a real student of popular culture, and she's really the one who got me into all of that in celebrity. And I do find myself regretting that I could never go back to her and say, look, Mom, I did this. And there's one in particular. So my mother always had a subscription to Vogue, and we read it together from the time I was 9 years old. And we would sit at the kitchen table and she would tell me, this is this model and this is this designer. And, we would go through everything. And our absolute favorite model was Karen Graham, who was the Estee Lauder model at the time. So going back to the 70s. After she passed away, I ended up working with Estee Lauder, with the Estee Lauder company. It made me really sad that I couldn't go back to my mother and say, oh my God, I was at the Estee Lauder offices today, and I was in Aaron Lauder's office, and we did an event with her, and she was so beautiful, and she was wearing Valentino and Manolo Blahniks and, all the stuff that she really would have found exciting.
This is the part of the interview where it gets incredibly sad, because in 2008, you lose both parents the same day. You talk about it in your book, and we're going to talk about your book in a minute, but if you can, take us back to that day and how did it change the course of your life from that point on?
It changed everything. So they wouldn't let me intervene in terms of, getting support for her. My mother really probably needed to be on anti-anxiety medication, antidepressive medication. She wouldn't entertain any of it. I was in Montreal visiting them, and we were leaving back the next day to Toronto. And I was really trying to say, please let me help you. And my mother was being really quiet and not saying anything, which was unusual for her. You know, the thing is like, it's easy to look back on things and say, here's all these signals, but when you're in the heat of it, you don't necessarily notice it. And my father said to me, you know, your mother doesn't want to be here anymore. I didn't really take that seriously for a number of reasons. One is I didn't think that was humanly possible. And two, my mother had made a lot of grand pronouncements over her life about things, you know, she was going to do this, she was going to leave, she was going to, you know, all this sort of stuff. My parents were sort of so compliant that I thought I had gotten through to them. And we went to the house the next day and we said goodbye. And that was the last time I saw my parents. So I started calling them that afternoon when we got back to Toronto, and I couldn't reach them. I was calling them till 1:00 in the morning. Then I was calling them till 6:30 in the morning. Somebody had disconnected the answering machine. I assumed my mother. It was my husband who found out first, because my brother and sister-in-law lived down the street from my parents, and someone called them and said, you know, there's police cars all over your sister-in-law's house, and we don't know why. So my brother-in-law came over. He was the one who found out what happened and called my husband. You know, just to loop in something that you said earlier about my mother disliking the word survivor for a number of reasons, you know, one of the things that occurred to me after this happened was that she had placed me in the position of now being a survivor. You know, people are now going to look at me and say, oh my God, you know, there's the woman who this happened to her parents. And, you know, I'm now a survivor of what happened to my parents. And I also really dislike the word survivor. We don't want to be judged by that. You know, our private battles are huge, but, you know, we don't necessarily want the input from the outside world or the judgment from the outside world about that.
I don't want to get into details, but your mom chose to leave the planet on her own accord, and your dad, there's still some uncertainty around it, but that same day you lost both your parents.
They were both in the garage. I know that my mother chose to end her life. How my father came to be in the garage and how he ended up also passing away that day is a bit of a mystery, but they were together. It's just not clear.
You know, we're going to talk about the Ripple Eclipse, this book that you wrote, and it's a beautiful book. Beautiful that you would share so much of this, and I think help so many people. But just before we get to that, I was really taken, because I'm a father of two daughters, that you cited that what your mom had given to you is not something you were prepared to give to your children. Were you that concerned that DNA, that I don't want to be a survivor, that entire mentality would roar through you to the point where you said, I've got to counter that now, or history's just going to repeat? I
was terrified. So I went into therapy for the first time when my daughter was 6 weeks old, because I felt completely ill-equipped. And at that point, I went back to work right away. Not the easiest pregnancy. I had a newborn. It wasn't about that. It was about replicating the behaviors I saw in my mother. And there were two things. One was, you know, this fear-based existence, which I didn't want to live. And the other was this control issue. So how am I going to let my children lead their own lives? I mean, obviously it wasn't too much of a concern when my daughter was 6 weeks old, but, you know, I knew that it was going to be a concern. And to be honest, was I 100% successful at that? No. And I think what I was so worried about was I found that I was like defaulting to the way my mother was thinking. So even though I really resented it and I rebelled against it in my own life, it was the default. You know, being cognizant of those things really is the first step to making those changes. You have to be self-aware. But then, you know, everything was pretty much taken out of my control when my parents died, because then that became part of my children's legacy as well, particularly my daughter. When we return, my conversation with Audrey shifts to her book, The Ripple Eclipse. We learn about the meaning behind the title, and more importantly, the meaning behind the powerful words within its pages, including an emotional trip back to Auschwitz.
Hi, this is Tony Chapman. I want to talk to you about what RBC Wealth Management is doing to support healthy aging. Old age is becoming old news. We're living longer, and planning for our future means we need to integrate health, wellness, and our financial matters. RBC Wealth Management is partnering with leading experts and organizations like the MIT Age Lab, the National Institute on Aging, the Women's Brain Health Initiative, Elder Caring, and the Women's Age Lab. Why? To provide you with comprehensive resources covering every aspect of you aging well. This includes support for your physical and mental health, caregiving, maintaining financial stability, and preparing for later life health issues, ensuring you can age safely and comfortably, and ideally in your own home. With RBC Wealth Management, you create a personalized plan that adapts as your needs change, giving you peace of mind and security. Visit rbcwealthmanagement.com and learn more about healthy aging and start planning for your future. Healthy aging? Well, that matters to you, to me, and to RBC.
Someone said to me, "Have you forgiven your mother?" I don't think I need to forgive my mother. That's not the way I look at it. She did not do this to me. I know that we were very well loved. If I was going to succumb to guilt, I was never going to be able to claw my way out of that hole.
My guest today is Audrey Romoff. She authored the book, The Ripple Eclipse, Turning the Tide of Inherited Trauma. It's a powerful memoir about family, survival, silence, and the courage it takes to break painful cycles. You write The Ripple Eclipse, and I thought the title itself was interesting, almost a metaphor, because an eclipse covers joy but doesn't destroy the light, you know? I mean, I'm curious where that title came from.
One day I was like sitting in the backyard, and it just occurred to me that that was what my life experience was, that there was always ripples that emanated from my mother, and they emanated through her, they emanated through me, they emanated through my daughter. But when my parents passed away, it really was like an eclipse. You know, I really looked at it as total darkness. How am I going to fight my way out of the darkness? That was not easy for myself or for my daughter. We both had very difficult, complicated journeys.
The interesting thing about your book, and in many ways, it's sort of the underpinning of this entire story, the false front and what's happening beneath the scenes. The fact that I am a survivor, but I don't want to be called a survivor. Mm-hmm. Your book has that same sort of almost opposing magnets. It's a combination of darkness and humor, trauma and glamour. How did you find that balance? And why do you feel it was important?
Because I think that's what life is like. You know, I think even when you're having your darkest moments, there sometimes are funny or humorous things that can happen. And I'm going to call out John Irving, who is my favorite author and who I read from the time I was a very young child. And what he always wrote about in his books was how, you know, life could be so beautiful in 1 second, and then in a split second, it's changed and something horrible has happened. That had sort of somehow seeped into me. And I think it's because that was how I viewed life too. It's strange because when you're going through the acute part of trauma, you don't want to feel any joy. You actually feel like you're betraying. I felt like I was betraying my parents by doing that. Certainly when I was growing up, you know, kind of like the humorous things, you know, when your mother's going to tell you, no, you can't go swimming because if you drown, you're going to ruin your brother's bar mitzvah. You know, there is some humor that's around that sort of thing. And it wasn't like that. There was this persistent negative drag that was happening in my life, but I also had a lot of good things that were happening in my life.
Your daughter, Lindsay, you both take a trip to Auschwitz and you bring a PBS crew to film it. What did that mean for both of you?
Lindsay actually was really interested in going, and it's a trip that she never would have done because, you know, how do you come to your mother and say, oh, Mom, I'm going to go to Auschwitz? You know, I think she would have thought that was too painful for me. It was something I did not want to do. I very strongly did not want to go back to Poland and see all the stuff that I saw. Not Auschwitz, not the tenement house where my parents, where my mother's family was interred, not the church where the selections were made. I felt like I've lived with the Holocaust my entire life, and I didn't need to see it. I think it was really hard on both of us. The crematoriums and the gas chamber was really the most difficult.
I had a speaking engagement over in Warsaw, did a trip around Eastern Europe, and that said I will see the Auschwitz at the end because I know it'll change me. and it was the most horrific thing I've ever experienced. I continue even now to wonder how that exists inside humanity. I can only imagine what you two went through. Those are days where I wish I wasn't human.
We had a museum curator who was with us because we had a TV crew, and we were standing at the crematorium, and he said to me, "This is the worst place on earth."
So as we move forward in your life with Lindsay, your son, how are you doing?
I'm just not one of these people who thinks that everything gets wrapped up with a bow, even if you're in therapy, even if you're taking medication, even if you're trying to face it and you go to Auschwitz, even if you write a book about it. There is, something in the book that I call the hollow, which I've lived with, I think, since the time I was a child. There is something missing. And I think for me, it's more about accepting what I am, accepting what's missing, and understanding that I'm always going to have grief. The way I describe it, if you're lucky, it walks beside you. And if you're less lucky, it overtakes you. Lindsay and I are examples of the grief walking beside us, but my mother was an example of being overtaken by the grief. So I do have an appreciation that you have to fight to stay in the light. Even if it's not going to be rainbows and unicorns, you need to stay out of the darkness.
Do you ever remember a time when your mom was in the light that you said that could have been the mom if she hadn't had Auschwitz that would have raised me?
Yeah. I definitely saw glimpses of it. I just wanted a normal mother, whatever that is. I know every family has their stuff, but my mother was broken by an experience that was completely beyond her control. She tried. She was an onion and she had all these layers to her. And I think she was terrified of having those layers peeled away. And that's why, she couldn't really come to terms with everything that had happened to her, because I think she didn't want to face it, why she didn't want to do therapy, why she didn't talk about it. And I think she was trying so hard to keep herself intact that took up all her energy. Ultimately, she just didn't have the ability to put one foot in front of the other anymore. And that's why she made the decision.
I'll be sure to put a link so people can buy your book, really feel the words that I felt reading it. But there's three things that you said that I really want to highlight, because I always end with my three takeaways. One is look for validation in the right places. I related to you in the marketing world that no matter how lovely that client is, they will fire you one day. And if you chase validation from people that really don't matter, it's not to say they don't matter for your business. They might matter in terms of your relationships, but look for where validation, the people that matter most to you. The second is I wish your mom had lived longer to see how that Vogue magazine that she shared with that young girl became your life. I'm wondering in many ways you chased that life as your way of saying we had those moments together. In some ways, it was as much a legacy to your mom as it is your legacy. And then the final thing is every part of this interview, your grandmother, your mother, yourself, is this sense of compartmentalizing, trying to hold on, contain, manage. And you said it so well at the end. Yes, that is everything about life. Even as Irving said, that life can be beautiful and next time it can be shit, but ultimately fight to stay in the light. And I thought that was one of the most beautiful ways of describing, even as you said, in darkness, where you really don't want to see the light because you feel you'd have to accept this pain, that if you constantly fight to stay in the light, you have a fighting chance. That and so much more is really what I found out of the Ripple Eclipse. And I appreciate you joining me in Chat of the Matters.
Thank you, Tony. I really appreciate it. It was, it's great questions. Thank you.
Once again, a special thanks to RBC for supporting Chat That Matters. It's Tony Chapman. Thanks for listening, and let's chat soon.